Hey, Justin Hughes, licensed professional counselor here. I am excited, per typical, for presentations. This one hits close to my heart. Scrupulosity, when OCD gets tangled in religious and moral matters. We are going to cover all the things, all the details. I have an Ask Me Anything chat. So going to cover how we'll do that here in just a moment. But again, just really, really happy to be here with you today. Okay, so introduction, just real quick. I'm Justin Hughes, licensed professional counselor. There may have been many ways that you have discovered me, be it on the community events calendar with the International OCD Foundation. Maybe you've attended something OCD Texas, or you've read one of my articles online, or however you found this today. I'm just really glad that you're here. This is such a neat opportunity. So I'm the owner of Dallas Counseling here in Dallas today. Do we have any other Texans, any other folks from Dallas? Drop some notes in the comments. Where are you from? What part of the world? Sometimes you get a little bit of an international following with live streams, which is awesome. Would love to know where you're from, but it is hot, hot, hot here in Dallas. We've been hitting 100-degree temperatures, over 100 heat index, and I'm really fortunate to be in here. But wearing my world shirt, thinking of folks all throughout the world, and I hope you're staying cool if you're in a hot location like mine. So yeah, anyway, owner of Dallas Counseling. I'm a clinician, a therapist, a CBT therapist who specializes in the treatment of OCD and anxiety. I'm an advocate, a passionate advocate, and also the forthcoming author, working title, The CBT Workbook for Christians with OCD. So right away, if you are watching on a TV, you can point your smartphone at this to get a free gift. If you are not a subscriber yet, please join. Lots of free stuff, information, and truly, right away, the welcome email, you get a ton of downloads, several ebooks for free, ranging from working with the family in OCD to questions more on the moral side, or intrusive thoughts sinful, things like that. So a lot of resources here. Okay. And also just want to cover some of the basics of this presentation. So Ted Witzig, Dr. Ted Witzig, he's become a good friend of mine, and he's a colleague. He's been around for several years through International OCD Foundation and other places. And he gave this presentation today in multiple places, originally 2016 at the International OCD Foundation Conference annual in Chicago. And he has graciously allowed me to reproduce the slides here. But they're his. Now, my comments are my own, but we're going to be pretty close to each other on a lot of these things. But just so you know, it is totally his. And also, this is not therapy. Not therapy. What does that mean? A lot of people say it. It sounds like a fancy legal disclaimer so we don't get sued. Well, yeah, there's kind of that. But at the same time, I want you to know, what is the difference between education and therapy? Education is information, it's tools. Sometimes it's a lot of the exact same things that we'll talk about in therapy, but it is different to work with your own health provider on a treatment issue. Very, very different. And so don't disregard what a provider's saying. There are so many factors that go into, and sometimes it involves some creative details that go into therapy. Also, I don't have any financial conflict of interest, just so you know that. We say that more in professional presentations, but I want to say that here as well. There's nothing that you have to buy or that I get money from here today, other than maybe, I guess, reputation if people come to see me or whatever. But I'm happy to do this regardless, because I'm passionate about this and people getting better, finding freedom. And yeah, so content it's meant for a diverse audience. I want it to be accessible for anybody because it's about OCD, but I also add in a little additional subspecialty with Christians. So just FYI. And then the Q&A throughout, if I see some questions that seem to pertain, ultimately I might snag one then, but at the very end, several of my subscribers have already asked questions That's one of the perks that you get when you're a subscriber. You get that access where you can get more oversight to these questions and more attention. Okay, very good. And it looks like we've got another Texan. Good, Jennifer. College Station. Very good. Yes, yes. Love it. Tennessee. Yes. Knowing the Norse. Victoria. Therapist with no OCD. Awesome. Kansas. Yep. Animal lover. For sure. Also, just this question that I keep on getting, is this going to be able to be seen afterwards? Absolutely. This presentation is recorded, auto uploads to YouTube immediately. Okay. So let me jump on in. Let's do this. Y'all ready? Okay. So here's Dr. Ritzig's title screen. Scrupulosity, we got to get into definitions, right? Let's go back to how we got the word. So scruple, it's derived from the Latin scrupulus, a rough or hard pebble. It causes discomfort. Actually, if we go back further, it was Cicero in Latin that used scrupulum. And at the time, it could reflect an anxiety, a small thing. And then it went forward in English where scruple was derived from this Latin, scrupulus, scrupulum at first. And then we began to see it as a moral interpretation of a thought or circumstance so insignificant to affect only a very delicate conscience. Many people can think of a pebble in one's shoe causing distress, discomfort. It's small but annoying. Shakespeare used the word scruple. It was used to reflect a small weight or measure. So that's where this term specifically comes from. Now, when we get into the clinical side of things, what are we talking about? Well, scrupulosity sometimes is used in other environments. So maybe in a church environment or whatnot. And I'm not here to say that any other definition is inaccurate. Just like the word obsession can mean different things in different environments. We may mean it with something more positively. We may mean it with something more of like an addiction. But when we say an obsession in OCD, it is a very specific thing. We are not guessing about this. We're going to talk about this a lot. There are so many things that we're not guessing anymore about what this is. We know how these things function. And we know for most people how to find ways to break free. We just have to do it, and it's hard work. So obsessions in OCD are intrusive, unwanted thoughts, urges, images, impulses, really any unwanted internal experience that comes up that is distressing, it's persistent, it creates some level of impairments for the person, and the person wants to make that go away. That starting point is intrusive. Sometimes it gets a little tricky in OCD. People will question, oh, is it really intrusive or not? That's a whole other thing, obsession. But from a clinical standpoint, it's intrusive. So when we're talking about scrupulosity, that's what we're talking about with OCD. Obsessions and compulsions particularly pertain to religious themes, morality, pathological doubt, worry about sin, excessive behaviors, religious behavior. That is what we mean when we say scrupulosity with OCD. Does religion cause OCD? No evidence. That's one of the things about OCD. It is remarkably consistent across different populations, across the board. It, for the most part, once you're an adult, it affects males and females pretty similar. There's a little variance for children and teens there. But then when we look at cultures and belief systems, it's an equal opportunity disability, if you will, disorder that really doesn't discriminate based on those things. It plays off of the thoughts and the beliefs and the values that a person comes to the table with or is wrestling with or is thinking about. So no evidence to believe that religion causes OCD. So what is the nature of the problem? So we're talking about spiritual things, and when we look at topics of a spiritual nature, it's important for us to call out that anybody can struggle with a spiritual issue, whether with OCD or not. And sometimes those struggles can lead to anxiety. But going through such a spiritual struggle does not necessarily mean that a mental disorder is present. So on both sides, a person can have a lot of anxiety, but not have OCD, and they can have a faith problem, a spiritual problem that they are facing. And a person with OCD can have a lot of anxiety and not even have what would be defined as a faith problem whatsoever. Very, very interesting. And I know that that raises a lot of questions for various folks, especially Christians, that, well, is anxiety a sin in and of itself? By the way, subscribe, because I wrote a free ebook on this whole thing, that whole topic, to really discuss that in depth. But just to be clear, on the faith problem side, if we probably define it in different ways, right? But let's say a problem of faith is an overt example of lacking faith. So I know that I am supposed to not have an answer to something and to trust God by faith. Maybe that when God says to love my neighbor as myself, well, what about when that hurts? What about when I'm afraid in a recession or with inflation about my finances? Should I save this? Do I need this extra? But I have the opportunity to love my neighbor. And I think that the step of faith is to give away some money to somebody. Well, if I take a step back and I say, no, absolutely not, God, I'm not going to do that. Maybe that's a faith problem. But the problem for OCD is the fact that though we can all have faith problems at any time and spiritual problems, a person can be at a spot where they're totally square with their beliefs in theology and all of that, and still have these doubts and uncertainty. So just some clarification about faith problem. Let me jump into some specifics here that come from Dr. Abramowitz and Jacoby back from 2014. This is a cognitive behavioral model of scrupulosity. So I want you to pay attention to top right, where this goes. If you can see my arrow here. Let me talk about the OCD cycle, first of all. We understand OCD to function in this way, that first of all, you have to have a context, so the trigger, but it's just a context. Anywhere, anytime, any place, maybe certain places bring up something more, the context. So that is your trigger, so to speak. But in OCD, a person experiences an intrusion about something. And that intrusion leads to distress because they interpret it as threatening. Well, if it's distressing, we want that to typically go away pretty naturally. So if we try to make that go away with compulsions, we then reinforce the obsession because we are saying to ourselves, to our brain, through our actions, through our thoughts, that this thing is scary. So we pay attention to it. Well, if we expand that a little bit to understand scrupulosity from a cognitive behavioral standpoint, that's haven't talked about what that is. I'm sorry, you're going to need a full primer on that. If you don't know, check out on my YouTube channel, ERP for OCD. That will give you the full primer on it, but it's basically the most effective treatment modality in treating OCD. So we view it from this standpoint, that there's an external trigger, there's an intrusive thought, same thing, interpret it as significant or meaningful. So I pass by a homeless person almost every day on my drive. I'll see folks that are homeless in Dallas. And if I interpret it as to walk by faith, I need to give this person money, or I need to give them an encouraging word, or fill in the blank, and I don't. If that's an intrusion in OCD, if that's an obsession, then to interpret that as significant might be, I'm a bad Christian, I'm a bad person, I didn't help that person, they're suffering, I don't know their story. And this is where Scroop stuff comes in. Fear of sin, fear of God, obsessional preoccupation, doubt, and naturally anxiety or distress that will happen. So if I want that distress to go away, well, okay, I can just force a quick decision, right? Just take some money real quick, even if it goes against what I've decided otherwise. Maybe I've thought at other times that it's not wise to hand out money. In fact, a lot of the homeless organizations here in Dallas have done public campaigns to help access people on the streets, but not actually just hand out money, because sometimes that can create cycles of homelessness, a whole concept in and of itself. But let's say if that's my viewpoint, and in reality, what I would do is spend time with a homeless ministry, donate some money to a homeless ministry, but then I get this trigger that's outside of what I had decided otherwise to do, then the compulsion in that moment would be to compulsively just give money to feel better, or compulsively ruminate on it to figure it out, and maybe to do penance through a different type of behavior. And throughout this, you'll see to the left, intolerance of uncertainty, which is baked into OCD, not being able to tolerate the uncertainty of, well, maybe that person could have used the money. Maybe I need to change my approach. There's always going to be uncertainty that we have to face in life. And also, to clarify too above, the ways that we make, or the ways that thoughts and beliefs are significant to us are because we have some pre-existing beliefs about it. We also have some personal views, our worldview, our religious beliefs, doctrine that feed right into that. We'll get into that more. And so if I compulse on it, well, I reinforce that thing is scary. I might get some temporary anxiety reduction, but then long-term sensitivity towards those intrusive thoughts. What's going to happen the next time when I see a homeless person? I'm not going to say, well, I'll just default to what I decided. What's going to happen is I'm going to be more sensitized towards that and hypervigilant towards it as well. So I'm going to run through a ton of scrupulous symptom examples here, just in case some of these might connect for you. And as Ted points out, some may appear to be reasonable thoughts for a religious person, some may not. The issue occurs that in a person with scrupulosity, they're not able to move through the doubt and go on and become fixated. So some thoughts are just totally reprehensible, just right off of the bat. But then some thoughts may have seemingly a little bit more value, but that doesn't make it any less obsessional. So if I obsess on how to love my neighbor, yeah, absolutely, that's a good thought to be thinking about, but it's still obsessing on that. And that's what we can always address with OCD. And if you address that, you begin to win when faced with OCD. Okay. So examples: worrying, you didn't repent right. Confessing sin. Did I do it right? Did I say it in the right way? Did I leave something off, for example? The worry that you might be praying to Satan instead of God. Numbers like 666. Worship an idol. Fasting. Did I do it long enough with the right heart? Did I do it in the way that is prescribed, recommended, etc.? Worrying about whether feeling peaceful, and how do I know if I really have peace with God? And so right on that last one, when we think of the anxiety that actually comes up in OCD, it's just naturally one of those things that feeds such a nasty cycle, because if I'm checking deeply within my body, sensation checking is very common in OCD. Well, first of all, I'm going to find something if I look for something. And if I'm already prone towards interpreting that negatively or interpreting it as a threat, I'm going to pay attention to, for example, as I give this presentation, I have a little bit of anxiety right now. Of course, I have never had a presentation where there's zero anxiety. Or zero fear about anything. There's a lot of working components. It's in front of others. This is a live audience. Fill in the blank. But if I start to really narrow in, and then I link that with a faith concern, well, I'm supposed to be anxious for nothing. And now that if I'm doing that, then I'm clearly sinning, and it gets into a spiral. So these would be examples where, again, the thought could be something that's actually based on the larger belief, but it could also be kind of a trash thought, so to speak, like worrying one might pray to Satan instead of God just accidentally. That's a really good example that just feels that way for a lot of people. Not that they would argue that on paper, that that's what's actually happening. All right, so worrying about whether you're feeling peaceful enough to know you have peace with God, that you've not made a complete enough confession, not been able to make restitution well enough, committing blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, feeling that you're unworthy to take communion, Eucharist, worrying about might not have taken care of everything before doing so, make it right, all examples. Forgotten to repent of something, committed an unpardonable sin, the unforgivable sin as it's called sometimes. The verse warning, set no unclean thing before my eyes. Oh no, like what does this apply to? Intolerance of uncertainty, as I talked about in the model, is just baked in to all of this. If I can't tolerate the uncertainty of, well, being human, the possibility that there could be something, all right, well, off to the races. The brain is going to start sending those flags up more and more and more. And it can be so incredibly impairing, of course. Fears about dressing immodestly, moral issues, motive doubting, worrying whether you've been deceitful, just lied, whether your motives are pure. A lot of times, and by the way, notice that these are these categories that sometimes there is something very black and white. Sometimes there is a commandment that a person's thinking of, but sometimes it is very much up to conscience. So food and drink type of issues, for example, and the motive questioning, the motive doubting is so tricky because truly anything can be implicated there. So you could give the money to the homeless person and then think, well, I was annoyed that I had to give up money, and then start to doubt because of that and feel terrible, and so on and so forth. So the motive doubting is quite pernicious. Worrying that you might have omitted something from your confession. I kind of talked about that already. Reasoning backwards, that if you feel uncertain, you must have done something wrong. Sexual thoughts or thoughts of harm. Worrying about sexual arousal, all sorts of sexual arousal around children. That's a big example. The fear that could have happened. Worrying you might accidentally touch a child in the wrong way, connected. Worry that you might be gay. All sorts of different sexual thoughts come up in different ways. So a person may just walk down the street and worry or fear that, was I attracted to this person? They may have a reason to believe that they should or shouldn't, that I'm married, so if I found this person attractive, then clearly that's lust and this is wrong and I need to stop this. All of these things can be implicated in so much more. So how do we identify clinically significant religious impairments? Well, one suggestion here, and so you can see the full reference, it's Hathaway, 2003. Reduced ability to perform religious activities, to achieve religious goals, or to experience religious states due to a psychological disorder. So the thing about it is that it seems like to be more religious or moral or to have more faith is the goal, but one of the hallmark features of OCD is we start to see how much it impairs and blocks. And then it's one of the ways that we diagnose OCD, not the only way. But it negatively impacts. So one of the greatest examples to me are the many examples, many clients that have come in throughout the years who they have stopped reading their Bibles, for example, or they've stopped praying unless if somebody else is doing a prayer. And it's the irony of OCD that OCD may say, the obsession may say, you need to do these things in the right way, the perfect way, to walk by faith, whatever it is. You need to feel a certain way, have the right attitude and motives coming before God. But the irony of it is that it begins to impair that person. It blocks them from sometimes praying at all, or even reading their Bible at all, or study or fill in the blank. And we can see it on the outside when we look at that. We can write it down on paper. Most sufferers are very insightful towards this to say, yeah, I know, like definitely am impaired by this, but the challenge is in the moment, what to do when coming to the Bible or coming to prayer or fasting or whatever, when that urge is so strong to compulse. We're going to get into treatments here very, very soon. Okay. Urges and images, feeling like you might yell out a cuss word in your church, in your congregation, feeling like you just gave the person the finger, or even just thinking of that internally. Urges, that's interesting, right? Wait, what? Like, urges are part of OCD? Absolutely. A person can feel any sort of perceived urge, and it can be impossible to differentiate at times from is this a true urge or not? And that's, we learn to not spend the time trying to differentiate. We base it upon the framework of the person that we're working with. Again, we'll come back to treatment in a second. Images, having horrifying images of blasphemy or sexual images of a religious figure. And then compulsions, what are the ways that the sufferer tries to make it better, tries to feel better about these things, confessing over and over, seeking reassurance, refusing to sign one's signature until reading every word on a document. And sometimes a person gets stuck at such a nuanced level, well, one, that they avoid it entirely, but it is so painful to hear and to watch people suffer because it can take hours to go through a single document. Looking things up in the Bible to see if you've committed blasphemy, having to hold your hands a certain way, praying certain directions, all examples. Mental rituals, neutralization, trying to undo bad thoughts by thinking a good thought after a bad thought, replaying situations over and over to see if you've sinned, repeating words in your prayers such as in Jesus' name, in Jesus' name, in Jesus' name, amen, asking God for forgiveness over and over again just to be sure you didn't forget to ask again, trying to analyze, figure things out, confessing the same things over and over. Incredibly painful. Okay, so what differentiates the two? And one of the questions that I had gotten, actually, I put this on a slide, so subscribers got that early access to ask questions and for us to clarify, was around normal religious practice and how to do that. So what differentiates the two? Witzig did fabulous in this separation, and it's based on research of several folks, but organizing this together, there's 10 separations between healthy fear and scrupulosity that he offered. Fear. A healthy faith is not associated with debilitating worry and fear. And what do we do about that? Fear is oftentimes implicated in a lot of moral and spiritual, religious obsessions and values too. Fear not, be anxious for nothing, do not be afraid. And so what do we do with that? Well, big picture, we can look at the fact that healthy faith is not associated with debilitating worry and fear. One of the major separations here. So also, number 2, entangling. Number 1, again, apparently on the slides here. 1. Entangling, the more you focus on scrupulosity, the more entangling it is and the worse it gets. It creates stress. And that's not true of healthy spiritual practice. So prayer is a great one. If I learn to pray throughout the day, if I learn to pray at some set times, if I set aside some time for prayer, it's something from a healthy normative standpoint that might feel any number of things, could feel distressed one day or whatnot, but it's not entangling. It's not obsessing over how long or necessarily one particular detail about that. And though there may be stress on a passing occasion or a topic of prayer or something that's really uncertain, it is not entangling, and that's different. Non-responsive. Okay, so why do we say that? Scrupulosity, particularly OCD, is not responsive to spiritual interventions. Well, how do you know, Justin? Well, of course, I have to tolerate some uncertainty that there could be something out there, or maybe sometimes people find some benefit. And this does happen regularly, where a person may say, I found some benefit doing something, but why do we say it's not responsive to spiritual interventions? Again, we're talking about OCD. We're not talking about the growth of one's faith or growth of one's practices, because if a person does that, they may get the normal benefits and results from doing that. So growing their prayer life in a way that's not scrupulous, a person may start to notice that they feel a little closer to God, that they are thinking of the well-being of others, that they are fill in the blank. Well, scrupulosity, specifically that, though, does not improve by praying more. It does not get OCD, is not treated through attending church more or listening to sermons or answering that theological question, because it gets caught on that and baked into those recommendations of why we do treatments, and why I even recommend competent treatment providers in OCD, even more than specifically a spiritual solution, is that we're not talking about a spiritual problem. We're talking about a neuropsychiatric problem that is treated most successfully, most of the time, through means that are very well established at this point. And yes, there's always going to be mystery with those things, but that's just a little bit more of why we say it's non-responsive to spiritual interventions. Oh yeah, just for reference to Dr. Ted Witzig is bivocational. He's a psychologist and also a pastor. And so he's he's kind of the first on the front lines of somebody who can say, yeah, I know this sounds wild, that I'm saying that scrupulosity is not responsive to spiritual interventions, but as a pastor as well, he can see those separations. And that's what we're trying to do with the treatment of OCD, is to put it in its proper place. Absolutely, we need to focus on the faith stuff that's important. And definitely from a faith standpoint, it can be integrated well through everything in life, but that's not the same as treating it through faith or spiritual interventions. I hope some of that has made sense. There's a lot to it, really. Okay. So, and by the way, questions are coming in. I love it. Just as a reminder, I will probably do most of those at the end. Okay, so also distress. So people typically enjoy and want to engage in any number of normal religious or spiritual practices. Now, of course, like, discipline is tough, and sometimes prayer is tough, and sometimes the sacrifice that it takes is tough, or fasting is tough. That's not the same, though, because walking away from it, a person may say, wow, I really got this benefit, right? I grew closer to God, or I really got to see this a little bit more clearly, or fill in the blank. And so in that sense, we say that people want to engage. It's egosyntonic, fancy term to say it's synonymous with the person's desires and wishes. But OCD is an ego-dystonic disorder. It goes against the person's wishes. If even in that moment they want to do that thing, it's because there's this big, scary thing that they want taken away. They don't want to have to face. Hallmark for identifying OCD. So the distress is one of the separations that we can make between healthy faith and scrupulosity. All right, so overdoing. The individual's practices are going to far exceed what's required by a particular religious group. Pretty straightforward, I think, on that one. Scrupulosity interferes with normal religious practice. So as I talked about earlier, just skipping out altogether. A person knows that they'd like to do different things, but then they have to skip it. The avoidance of attending one's local church, etc., or not partaking in things like communion, just total avoidance. Catholic clients will talk about with confession, they're wanting to do fill in the blank. Maybe it's the monthly confession, but they're not doing that at all. it interferes. And we've got just a few more here. The numbers are kind of messed up. I'm sorry. But narrow. The individual's beliefs and practices become very narrowly focused on getting it right. And loses sight of deepening the relationship with God. Overlooking, the individual may focus so much time and energy that they overlook more important aspects of faith. And one of the biggest foundations that can really help in walking with clients into treatment is to be able to make it at a level that they can. Treatment has to be hierarchical. It has to be at a level that a person can access it. Just like development. We don't expect little kids to make giant leaps. When my daughter's brought home her artwork, I don't tear it up and say, look at this trash. This doesn't belong in an art museum. No, it blesses my heart. There's a good Texas phrase, because it's my daughter. One, I don't care. Probably at any time she could come home with a blank piece of paper and say, here you go, Daddy. And I'd love it. But developmentally, I appreciate where she is. And so we have to be hierarchical with people in treating OCD. We have to appreciate what they can do. And part of the commitments that can help that person to get into the therapy and get into the practice is to say, okay, you know what? I agree that I'm overlooking more important aspects of my faith, and I'm going to make the jump. I'm going to make that leap of faith to try therapy, to appreciate that as much as in the moment I get caught on this, I'm trying to break free from overlooking these other more important things. It feels like I need to answer today the question of whether I'm going to hell or not. But I have the foundation in my beliefs, and I've already talked to my pastor to know, and I just feel so much doubt. I just feel so much uncertainty about that. Okay, can you make a commitment that because you're overlooking all these other things, you're not even going to church, you're not even reading your Bible, you're not even praying because of fear, that maybe, just maybe, we could do some treatment that doesn't immediately talk about that the details that compulsively you're going to want to get into. They're going to feel that urge that it's absolutely essential. And it's easier said than done, but when we couch it in those terms of the commitments as a part of ACT, acceptance and commitment, we'll talk about that in a moment. It's a starting point to say, okay, I'm willing to try this. I'm willing to tolerate a little bit of distress, that maybe I'm going to do a therapy exercise instead of getting reassurance from my therapist whether or not I'm going to hell. And we have to do this step by step. Okay, so let's see. Also, scrupulosity just resembles other subtypes of OCD, and this as closely resembles, I would say, completely resembles other subtypes of OCD. It is OCD, and there's an overt focus on compulsion. So if it looks like OCD, smells like OCD, but it doesn't feel like OCD, we have to learn step by step by step by step to trust that process of lean in a little bit. And I don't feel like it feels like something real. It feels like something that I need to do, but we find that access point. In Texas, we have these on-ramps to the highway that if you, in some places, are just so fast. I lived in Illinois and Minnesota before moving to Texas. And the on-ramps were like, in Minnesota, like a quarter mile long sometimes for a highway. Here, they can literally be like 50 feet. And sometimes that's just all you've got. You just got this little tiny on-ramp to do treatment. Well, one of the things that can help people appreciate that they need to do treatment is that once we start to label these things, they start to recognize and identify, oh, so wait, that can be an obsession, that's a compulsion, that whole list of things and more that you mentioned. Well, it can create a lot of buy-in, and that's really helpful. And then also people with scrupulosity have other symptoms and subtypes. I kind of see that as the same as what I just said. Okay, very, very good. Yeah, I'll tell you what, I am getting a ton of questions here. So let me see if there's one that kind of pertains to what we have. Thank you so much. Knowing the North, praying this is life-changing. I pray that as well. Absolutely. And can I include treatment methods for religious OCD? Absolutely. Cure. Let me talk about that for a second. So, Nean Utopia, so glad you're here. How do we understand OCD from its treatments and the ability to cure it? Well, so there's no known cure for OCD in the sense that you would literally have to get rid of your brain to cure it, which isn't a cure, right? That's not a suitable answer. So as long as we have a brain that is fully functioning, we will have the ability to have thoughts that are distressing. And in research and study, and even just in the case reports through hundreds of years, by the way, of examples of OCD that we now understand looking back through time, it doesn't appear that we can really plan for at this point. Maybe there will be a cure at some point, but an automatic cure where a person doesn't have to maintain treatment. It can be like cancer in remission. It can be like diabetes maintained. But if you pull away those supportive treatment factors, by and large, how we understand it is that it's those intrusive thoughts can still show up. And as soon as a person starts compulsing and interpreting those as threatening and significant, they're back to the races. This is why treatment has to be durable. And this is why we need to develop strong treatments with relapse prevention, help people to maintain it over time. How do you remove guilt and self-doubt? You don't entirely. You probably don't want to. I don't know you personally, Nean Utopia. These are great questions. But to remove it means that you wouldn't have a conscience. And my guess is that you're not wanting that. So, but what most people ultimately mean is, well, yeah, some people would like to remove those uncomfortable feelings. But what most people generally mean is, when will this stop disabling me? When will this stop impairing me? And that is absolutely possible. A person can get to subclinical numbers at any given time. Some people are surprised to learn this. I don't actually have OCD. I would say that I'm in remission from generalized anxiety disorder because it no longer impairs me and has not for years. But I have to maintain things every single day in my life. And so to not be impaired, to not be controlled, absolutely. To get to subclinical, that's right, what I was going to say is that at any given point, when I take the Y-box assessment, I'd probably score a subclinical 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 points, which is subclinical, just because I get lots of intrusions. I get distress over intrusions sometimes. But by and large, I don't have OCD. So can you cure it? Not that we know of. Is there freedom? Absolutely. Okay. Good. Let me do one more here. Waking up with a sense of doom and hopelessness and how to overcome that. So it depends. In the slides, I'll cover this now because the slides don't specifically talk about this. We really have to analyze it functionally, functional analysis, or sometimes we say assessment, where the doom and hopelessness, is that connected to an obsession? If so, then we treat it the same way as anything else. Now, if I wake up with, this didn't happen, fortunately, I've been doing this. I've done my own exposure work for doing presentations. But there were moments where I woke up with doom and hopelessness. But the functional assessment for me, what was the function of my thoughts and beliefs there? Well, was that I don't know very much. I'm pretty new at giving presentations when I felt this years ago. And so that's very, very different. If the function of those beliefs it fits the model of OCD, then it's going to be about identifying what is the obsession and just very briefly, very quickly, what feels threatening about that, because your interpretations are what filter that as a significant thing. And do you believe those interpretations? If you really believe them, you might need to do some cognitive work, which I'm going to get into here in a moment on that. But if it's just kind of trash talking, you don't really believe it on paper, but it just feels true, well, then we just got to get cracking on how do you do an exposure around doom and hopelessness. Now, this is not a recommendation for you. I'm not your therapist. I don't know all the nuances that go into it, but an educational way of looking at that is if you identify the threat, the felt threat, and you recognize, well, I'm avoiding this thing or I'm doing this thing to feel better, that's going to reinforce in the brain that you have to do that thing to feel better. And then if you're not feeling better, you feel worse. So you feel like you need to do that thing more, and it's a vicious cycle. So let's say doom and hopelessness, that maybe if it's scrupulosity, if you're missing, feel like you're missing something, or feel like you should be hitting your knees and praying immediately and do that for an hour, but you feel like you don't have that time or can't do that. We have to do a functional assessment on that, and you've got to find the compulsions, if this is OCD specifically, and then start to identify how can you knock out those compulsions? How can you face the fear step by step without doing the compulsion? And that would just be an example way of how you could approach that. So very, very good. Okay, so I am going to drop this comments off, and we're going to keep going here. Treatments, aspects of treatment. So in many ways, it's going to be the same as OCD because it is OCD. This is OCD. If you're identifying it as a faith problem and there's no OCD, then you need to talk to your clergy member. You need to talk to that pastor, that someone in your church, someone in your community group, etc. But if you have OCD, well, then you may actually still do those things with an asterisk. We want to make sure you're not doing those things compulsively because that will make the OCD worse. So we treat it the same with appreciation for some of the nuances for scrupulosity. Additional time and attention oftentimes have to be given to understanding and respecting religious beliefs. Do clinicians, especially clinicians that don't have a particular affiliation or don't say anything like, oh yeah, I'm a Christian therapist, or oh yeah, I work with Muslims, or oh yeah, I work with fill in the blank. Well, not necessarily, because if what you need to do with OCD is to not compulse and compulse less and less and less, if a person will read up, if they're sensitive towards that, if they have some experience with that, it goes a long ways. Absolutely, it's icing on the cake when you can get that person. I'm dual trained, got a big honkin' degree from a seminary that was twice as large as the average master's program, so that I could study theology and also study psychology. But I only know like one other person who's gone to seminary and specializes in OCD like I do. So it's important, absolutely, to respect the beliefs. But I just want to say right off the bat that if you have OCD and it's really impacting you, treat the OCD. If you can't get out of bed to do things that you otherwise would want to do, you could tell yourself all day long, well, I need to pray more, I need to fill in the blank more, or whatever else. Treat the depression, and of course, in a spiritually, religiously sensitive way. But I just want to be really clear about those things. Now, also, some other aspects of mental health are maybe just a little bit less straightforward. Could it be a faith issue? Maybe not. But the thing about OCD that I want to do again and again and again and again is to make a strong case for why we treat it as OCD, as a neuropsychiatric issue. And of course, we'll incorporate faith concerns as we go, but why we put that first. So collaboration with family members and clergy is also an important aspect of treatment. I recommend it the vast majority of times to somehow involve family, clergy, sometimes children, sometimes parents, a significant other, friends. I've invited people to bring their community group in or do a virtual call. OCD can really get into anything and everything, and building that treatment team is important. So you have to have an accurate diagnosis, assessment of OCD symptoms, education, that collaboration I just talked about, and also SSRI medication if needed. Is it okay to take medication? What? Is that a faith problem? Take the medication if you need it, if you're willing to try it. If you don't want to, that's fine. If you can get further with medication, but sometimes it can just really, really help. I just want to be clear about that. I don't have the time here to break down the whole rationale with that, but it can be tremendously helpful. And I just at least want to be a person to put that out there and say that. Now, I've taken medication for mental health reasons too, and it's been remarkably helpful. Okay, so aspects of treatment, continued cognitive treatment. This is, by the way, one of the differences with scrupulosity that is different than, let's say, contamination in OCD is that there is the known and researched presence of some more extensive cognitive distortions and the belief that those obsessions are actually true. Research has shown this, and I'm probably doing a disservice to how the research words it, but one of my friends and colleagues, Dr. Jed Siv and others, have a good couple of research articles on religious sexual obsessions and looking at some of those differences. And we know that there are some differences in oftentimes religious obsessions, more than any other category of obsessions, tend to be linked with the what we call overvalued ideation, that this has to be true. This must be true. Surely this has to be a faith issue. And so if you have a person who's suffering with OCD and they're feeling that, even if then in the back of their mind, they're like, but something's off, this can't be true. And then they go to a person that doesn't know OCD, either a therapist or clergy or whatever else, what's going to happen? Well, the person's going to follow their lead and be like, well, okay, I mean, you seem to know your theology, but yeah, that sounds pretty terrible. You're having all these blasphemous thoughts and these repetitive sexual thoughts. Yeah, okay, yeah, like, here's what you do. Flee temptation. Well, the problem is with fear, if you don't face it, it persists. Temptation, absolutely, we need to flee, which, by the way, is another one of my free guides, if you subscribe, to face fear, but to flee temptation. The problem is with religious, scrupulous, moral obsessions, there's a much stronger link to that overvalued ideation that somehow the person thinks, but I do need to be doing this. I can't stop at 10 minutes praying because if I do, I'm going to be sinning. Sometimes we have to spend just a little bit more time in the cognitive treatment, but we always have to be careful not to play into the obsession. So if you go to a non-OCD specialist who is just doing CBT, but not ERP, or claims they do CBT, because the reality is if you're treating OCD and you say you're doing CBT, the CBT treatment is ERP for OCD. Exposure and response prevention. I'm going to cover that in a second. Otherwise, it's just batting around the obsession, which reinforces it. And this happens with clergy, with family, and not because they're bad, not because they don't care. Quite the contrary. Accommodation is what it's called of the symptoms happens because people usually care. They love that person. They're just responding how they would with any other person. And kudos to them for doing that. But other people often don't know that that's feeding the cycle. Let me move on. Acceptance and commitment therapy. Learning to come to the present moment and not fight with thoughts. It's an adjunct to ERP, used very commonly, and it's particularly helpful with religious, moral, scrupulous obsessions, because it actually helps people learn a lot of the skills to sit with that distress, especially those just tormenting thoughts and obsessions and mental rituals, and having just such strong doubt and fear. Well, acceptance and commitment, baked into it, are skills to learn to be in the present moment, to practice diffusion, which is to not have to link two things together. So you look and you see that attractive person, that doesn't have to be anything else other than attractive person. But what if I felt something? What if something went on? Well, okay. Can you also have physical symptoms or sensations? Or what if your heart rate increases at that same moment that you see that person? Diffusion is a very, very important skill. But part of acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, is to recognize what a person's actual beliefs and values are, and to make dedicated commitments as a subset. So if the obsession is that seeing an attractive person is cheating on my wife, then, well, exposure in a second would be to, well, go in public and go to the shopping mall and just make an observation mindfully of other people. What do you notice? Hair color, eye color, things like that. And the person with OCD who has intrusions around that is going to feel like they're in sin, or, oh my goodness, like I noticed that they have blonde hair and my wife has brown hair, and well, maybe I was attracted. Okay, well, the exposure is going to be to notice. Acceptance and commitment jumps in to be present, to not fight the thoughts, to learn diffusion skills of, okay, blonde hair. And maybe even to get to the place where they say, okay, the person's pretty, okay. And then living in a way that's congruent with values. So when do I know? The biggest question of all, and actually it was asked, I'm going to circle back to it later, already asked by an audience member, is how do I know? How do I know? First of all, you have to have a commitment that you can tolerate, or you're willing to try to tolerate some uncertainty, because feeling like you know, ascertaining felt confidence is not what we're after. That's not what treatment gets you. It allows you to identify criteria and lines that you work with your values and beliefs, and to identify what are compulsions and obsessions, and then to sequentially begin to knock out those compulsions even when it feels, and you will feel like you're wrong, sinning, immoral. That is the point, but you have to do it, or the point is not that you feel that, the point is that you have to feel that while doing the thing that you value anyway. So if you feel immoral by walking out in public, that is going to create a lot of impairment. So walk out in public, observe 5 attractive people, and what are some features that caught your attention, and being able to do that in a congruent way. Now, for example, what would not be congruence? Okay, well, for example, as a Christian therapist, a lot of clients get scared of exposure. What's it going to involve? Like, is the therapist going to ask me to watch pornography? No, because that's going to go, that's incongruence from a faith standpoint. So, okay, well, in that case, what do I do for an exposure? Well, sometimes it really is as simple as just literally going out in public and not or learning to do that. Sometimes it's in the office where I pull up the International OCD Foundation website or the program guide for Denver, and oh my goodness, there's men and women that are pictured here, and there's some attractive men and women that are pictured here. Well, sometimes it starts with that. Sometimes it actually is too distressing to start there. Sometimes it starts with a word or a phrase, such as attracted. That may be the hierarchical first step. So the behavior therapy jumping into that, I've already talked about that a lot so far through some of these examples. Exposure and response prevention. It's not exposure to anything. You're not trying to just cause distress for no reason. You are exposing yourself to a situation that you need to be able to face, to violate your OCD, but live your values. Not violate your values, but to violate OCD. So OCD says don't go out in public, don't find people attractive, don't fill in the blank. So what you're going to want to do to violate your OCD is to feel those intrusions, act on your values, tolerate the distress, and not compulse. Simple, but it's very hard to do. This is why getting a good team around you is so important. And let me just give a plug too for therapy. Finding a provider who knows about OCD. Victoria, I don't know you, but you said you're a therapist with no OCD, and y'all are doing some great work. Looks like we've got, I see another therapist comment on here. Yeah, so just so you know, I don't care if you come to my practice or not. I mean, I'd love to see you. If you're out of state, I'd love to consult for a one-time session or whatever. But I am more busy I am so busy. All of this to say that the point is that you get good help. You walk with people who can walk with you. And it goes a long ways to find a treatment provider. Do you have to have that? No. But is it going to be a smoother transition into doing these things? Probably. So just want to leave that there. I'm never trying to be a salesperson. Relapse prevention, maintenance. I talked about that already, just the importance of that for the durability of treatments. Okay, so we're slightly over an hour at this point. And before I talk about those desired characteristics, thank you, Mr. Hood. This is so helpful. Awesome. Love it. And then Alexis, thank you. I have a strong desire to grow in knowledge and truly want to read my Bible daily, but OCD has led to me not doing so because I get so triggered and spiral. I'm so sorry. Yep, it exactly does that. And then thank you for just the love here in the comments. Same. Yep. Good. We have a Utah person. Good. Camera. Shout out. Utah. Oh, beautiful state. I want to go back to Utah. So much there. Okay. And then IPL Pro Carry. Yeah. Same here. Couldn't even open my Bible. Yep. Concentrate on positive verses. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. Also a therapist. Yes. Used to be in full-time vocational ministry with Crew. Yep. Majority of clients present with scrupulosity. Yep. So I hope you hear in this time today, you are not alone. Absolutely not alone. So it's OCD is OCD, and scrupulosity is a subset of OCD. And it goes a long ways to know that the particulars, the details other people struggle with. Now, be careful in the reassurance seeking, because I've worked with many clients throughout the years that want to know the exact wording of a specific thought or exact feeling. And we have to be really, really careful to not give into the compulsion, to obsess, to get reassurance, etc. With that. But it goes a long ways to know you're not alone. You are not alone. You're not alone. Do you hear that? All right. So desired characteristics of a core treatment team. Mm-hmm. Family members and close friends. Well, first of all, you're going to have family members and close friends, hopefully, period, and or people around you. And sometimes they might not want to participate, or maybe they're not the healthiest people. Maybe they're really toxic. And well, that's a different story. And I do work with clients that is the case. So sometimes it's about finding others who can support them. And because we're talking about religious and spiritual matters, I also want to go on record. I want you to hear that many that I come across and work with have experienced hurt, some abuse, some trauma, and it does happen. And both for those who are here today and you're suffering, I see you and I'm sorry. And for those that have suffered at the hands of others, maybe it was the parents, maybe a clergy member or whatever, it's real and it does happen. And I hate that. So I just want you to know that. I want you to be validated in that. And at the same time, that there are still opportunities to build here, to grow. And let's never get distracted from personalities, but find the principles. Personalities will always distract us, and and hurt us in different ways. And I've hurt others too in my lifetime. So if we look at the principles, if we look at the values, the things that really, really matter, that's what we're after. So a family member or friend, it's great when they're willing to learn about OCD, willing to stop accommodating OCD. So accommodation spiritually, great example. A teenager who comes up to their mom and says, hey, is it okay for me to go to the swimming pool? They know what the answer is. Like, yeah, of course, honey. Yeah, go. Like, well, what if I lust after others? No, you're fine. It's okay. Well, that can be such a sweet reassurance, right? And the parent might do the same thing for another child, but when we've studied it, when we've assessed it, when we look at it in OCD, and we start to see, oh, this is part of the compulsive cycle. The person won't take that action unless if they have the reassurance or unless if they have fill in the blank. Well, we want to get others who are willing to take that away. So the teen comes to the parents, hey, is it okay for me to do this? Or what do you think? Could I have done this? And I work with parents and family regularly in what to say. And depending on the relationship and how they approach it or how they prefer to approach it, some may say, sorry, I can't answer that. Maybe not. A shrug is one of my favorite responses if someone is perceived to be compulsing. Somebody who's willing to stop providing reassurance, we want that. Willing to attend sessions as needed. The physician and psychiatrist, that they can be religiously sensitive, of course. Listen, treat you kindly, understand the treatment for OCD, and then clergy willing to learn as well and not accommodate. So there's a lot more that I could say about it, but time, man, maybe we'll just have to do a second one. And a counselor who knows OCD, cognitive behavior therapy with ERP, and also it's suggested ACT. So I don't have super advanced credentials in ACT, and super advanced would be a specific certification. I've done a number of trainings, but ultimately somebody who can appreciate your values, the skills that go into sitting with distress and acting upon the commitments that you make out of your values, diffusion, as I talked about in many other things. So ACT, maybe it's not essential, but it's really helpful, especially for the religious and spiritual things. Willing to communicate and collaborate with a clergy person. So on the counselor side, these are all questions that you can ask these people up front. Hey, could you do this for me? Would you be willing to do this? That's how you build your team. It starts with a question. Hey, I think this is going on. I think I'm going to need this help. Is there a way that you see you could fit? And would you be willing to do this for me? That simple. And on the counseling side, a release of information as well. The HIPAA release, so that we can speak freely if that is implicated in that. Okay. Yes. Let me take a couple of questions. Yeah. So Cameron, the son has developed scrupulosity OCD on his mission. He's serving LDS mission, has 14 months left. He doesn't want to come home. Will it make it worse off for him to stay out? Oh man, Cameron, that's a tough place to be, both for him and I'm sure for you as a dad who cares. Oh, you said he has a lot of thoughts and seeks reassurance and doesn't feel worthy. Can OCD be caused? Okay, so two questions, maybe worse to stay out. I almost never recommend a person change their external commitments as long as it's a subset of what their plan is, what they're to do, unless if there is crisis that you are trying to triage. Because what happens is, unless if you are intentionally doing triage, you're intentionally doing treatment, such as going to a treatment facility or doing some intensive therapy or whatever, that oftentimes that extra time and space, there's just as many compulsions with maybe a few of the fewer external stressors, and that can actually really grow and begin to lead towards avoidance of getting out of the house or doing other things. And so it really depends. That is just going to need to be hopefully based with a treatment team. But if it's helpful, I want to say that I almost never recommend massively changing those external things unless if it is already indicated from one's values and beliefs. Like, oh man, some of my high schoolers weigh that, where, okay, I'm doing AP classes and I'm also doing an instrument and I'm also doing theater and I'm doing a sport. Okay, well, you might look at that just like a person who doesn't have OCD and say maybe take off something there. But for example, to completely put school on hold, that unless if you're doing treatment instead, it's or there's some other reason of crisis or whatever, it can create more problems. So that's just broad education and experience, of course. And then the cause of OCD, back to causal factors. Check out, depending on how you're watching this, just drop down to some of my other videos, my ERP for OCD and the common pitfalls in exposure and response prevention for OCD, all cover the cause of OCD. We don't know. Genetics have a decent link, especially if you have a first-degree family relative. It's close to 50% of OCD might be attributed to genetics there, but otherwise it's down to maybe 20%, 23 or so. Stress, absolutely. I mean, any disorder comes about with stress. Trauma, it's been researched. Definitely trauma to the brain has led to some rapid onset OCD, but these are all correlational. It's not a one-stop. There's not one thing that we know of, or even a mix of things that we know of that causes OCD. So great question. Now, oh, by the way, so many times trauma may have occurred and a person's symptoms started, and that's where clients and folks can feel confused, like, but it really seems like it was caused by trauma. Okay, well, fair. Maybe that was the stress that activated those genetics. We don't know. Maybe it was that time frame of life. I think it's the average age of onset is 18, 19. Most people, it's by puberty or young adulthood that they develop OCD. But I've seen 40-year-olds say, I really don't think I had symptoms prior to recently. And technically, theoretically, it's possible. And so it's just when we research it across the board, for all people, there's no direct causation of trauma, except in a very interesting case of brain trauma specifically. So it's covered in my ERP for OCD presentation. A family involvement, by the way, just continuing on with some of the things that are helpful or not. Research is really clear about this. Over involvement and criticism of the person. The over involvement can be the accommodation. The criticism, we call it expressed emotion versus family accommodation. And both of those are strongly connected to worse outcomes. And so that's where even if ERP is the most important thing, sometimes doing that becomes a real quick priority issue, at least simultaneously in most cases. So we want to pull family members in a healthy way. Real quick, I'm going to fly through these thinking errors because there's actually a number of places that you can look this up. Jonathan Abramowitz, on his website, you can just search Jonathan Abramowitz, PDF, Cognitive Distortions in OCD, and discover this. But common thinking errors are the ways that a person can interpret the obsession. And especially with scrupulosity, as I already talked about, these thinking errors have a little bit of a stronger hold in many of the scrupulous themes. Most people I'm talking to with a contamination obsession or a checking with a stove or locks don't have a hard time on paper saying, well, okay, I understand. Like, you can grab the door handle and not wash your hands, and that's okay. And that probably can be okay for most people are able to say that. But on religious, spiritual obsessions, it takes a little bit more of the cognitive therapy. And so one example is overestimation of threats. People with OCD, especially scrupulosity, really wrestle with this. Overestimate how likely the catastrophic things are to occur. Inflated sense of responsibility, intolerance of uncertainty, perfectionism, overimportance of thoughts, control of thoughts. All of these things are well-known cognitive distortions, thought patterns, that it's like a template that you use, or colored glasses. And so some of the work that we do from a cognitive standpoint is to actually change that out of the gate response. It's not most of the work in OCD, but it is important work. Okay, coping statements. This is where I use some slightly different wording. Instead of coping, I would actually say affirmations specifically. But by and large, it's probably just in the past couple of years where we've begun to change some of the language a little bit more, to not see it as, okay, I'm coping with my OCD. So given that this was created in 2016, it's only been a couple years that we've started to change the language to shift it more from fighting OCD to acknowledging. And the coping with facing and coping with affirming my values and my commitments to what I'm willing to do. But nonetheless, these are fabulous statements. Faith is not the absence of feeling uncertain. It's going forward through the uncertainty. OCD wants me to believe that uncertainty and doubt are dangerous. While uncertainty is uncomfortable, it's not dangerous, and I can tolerate it. My faith is what I believe, not what I feel. Feelings are not facts. Or the part that is a fact about feeling is how you feel, but it doesn't mean that what you think about that is factual, right? OCD is always going to bring up another what if. Those questions will lead me down to a path of never feeling good or certain enough. So caution, any statement can be compulsive. So use these as a shot in the arm of belief or reminder, but if you catch yourself having to say it before doing something, don't. But if you need to be encouraged in that, and on occasion, it's kind of like if you, in our OCD, relationship OCD, have to know that your wife or your girlfriend or your boyfriend or whoever loves you, and you feel that doubt, and so you have to be sure. So you call them and you wait to hear them say, I love you. And maybe they have to get off the phone really quickly, and you call them back. You're like, oh, hey, I love you. I love you. That's reassurance. Now, healthy assurance would be hearing that on occasion. So yeah, if you haven't said I love you to that person that you'd say it to or heard it in a bit, wouldn't be wrong to ask it. Same with this stuff. It doesn't have to be compulsive all the time, but look out for those compulsions where you're trying to maybe use a statement like that. Okay. Oh, yeah. This one's a perfect question right now. Once again, in Utopia, if one has intrusive thoughts or images, they try to replace the thoughts with positive ones. It's also considered a compulsion. Can you please give an example of CBT? Yeah. We always have to look at the function. The function meaning, how does this response function in this context? So just like with this, and the reason that I bring this up now is that you can use these positive statements compulsively. You can also use them as a shot in the arm, kind of like before jumping into a cold pool or taking a cold shower or something like, okay, you can do this, let's go, do it, is different than compulsing on it. And the reason, I don't know, you've asked some really good questions so far in Utopia. And in OCD, it seems like we have an axe to grind sometimes. If you've been around this community at all, and watch some videos where it's like, stop replacing your thoughts with positive thoughts. CBT without ERP, this is really helpful and healthy with some things, like with depression. If you do what's called cognitive restructuring, which we do with OCD, you will take a thought or a belief that is untrue and you restructure it with something that's more realistic or true or helpful, beneficial. It's the bigger picture. And that's massively helpful for mental health. However, OCD must be appreciated for what it is, because if a CBT clinician who treats depression just is working with OCD, and they're not trained in ERP and OCD, not trained in ACT, not trained in the things, they may do some of the same things that if a person's depressed and they're encouraged to have some positive coping statements to say, I can do this, I can go to church, I may feel overwhelmed, but it's okay. God loves me no matter what. God forgives me. I am welcome here. ... Well, what was the function of that? If that's a direct response to the obsession, which is I'm not welcome here until I say my prayers perfectly, you've now done a compulsion. And this is why getting a treatment team who knows their stuff, not perfect, but knows the basics, is so important, because treatment providers can be pulled into accommodation and can accommodate and not give helpful skills with that. So I hope that's helpful. Just a couple other comments here. No, thank you. Content has helped so much. Thank you so much. Knowing the North. Oh, yeah, okay. So some folks here starting at, oh, I see. You started at age 36, you said. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. 30s, it's not too late for onset as well. Thanks, Jared. Helpful content. Really glad to hear and see. Good. Okay. So as we keep going here. All right. Another statement, I can have faith and feel uncertain. One of my favorite prayers actually of the last year is, I believe, help my unbelief. And then God loves me completely, even when feeling uncertain and clouded by doubt. Dealing with intrusive thoughts. A few particular tips. Even though they feel real, intrusive thoughts say nothing about my true character. And the goal of intrusive thoughts is to shock and scare me, so I suppress or fix them. So we understand OCD. This is theory, but it's a descriptive way of providing it. Well, what isn't theory actually is the parts of the brain that are implicated. But the theory is that it's an overly sensitive alarm system. And when we do the brain scans, we see that alarm system is active. We see that the person's shifter, the anterior cingulate gyrus particularly, making decisions is stuck. It's like a stick shift car. I don't know how many people drive stick shift. Shout it in the comments if anybody does, and I will give you some praise, because that's pretty cool these days. It's like the shifter is stuck. In these parts of the brain that are highly implicated in OCD and in many other parts that we're still researching and studying. So the alarm system goes off, and I feel like I need to fix it. And the thing is, if you have scrupulous thoughts, clients report, and we as therapists know that you can't tell the difference in that moment between a real sense of conscience or obsessive doubt. One of the things that helps me explain this from a neuroscience standpoint is that so far as we know, that when a person accesses memories, typically in the hippocampus, that they're accessing the same place. So you do a functional brain scan where it lights up at the same time. The person is tasked with recalling a memory, and the hippocampus lights up the regions within. Well, whether that memory is real or made up or false or whatever else, it's still accessing the same place in the brain. So structurally, we have some reasons to believe that we might just feel the same way. If I think that I ran somebody over with my car, I'm probably going to feel terror, guilt, shame. Well, surely there's a way to differentiate that from, like if you look at it logically and you're like, but I haven't, there's no blood, I didn't see anybody, nobody on the news. And the unfortunate reality is, if you have OCD, I don't think that there's any evidence to say otherwise, that feeling is somehow distinct from when it feels real, which can sound really, really, or when it's identified as real, when it is real, that folks who've experienced, for example, trauma, folks who have experienced something that they now are just afraid of, there's no ability to differentiate those feelings in the moment. And so that's why you must have a treatment that supersedes that feeling. So a couple other things here that they're mentioned, but I'm going to keep moving on for time. You've got the slides you can refer to here at any time. So tips. One of OCD's biggest tricks is asking the question, what if this fear is an OCD, right? What if this feeling is an OCD? A matter of the conscience, like it feels this way. Like do I have a broken conscience, broken moral compass? This sure feels the same way when I was in my 20s and I felt like it was. Well, so the trick is, isn't this OCD? Are you sure? And treatments helps us to step-by-step sequentially identify the problems, where it gets in there, where it makes it worse. Sequentially, how can we insert the change in our response or non-response? And we have to do that at a pace that outpaces OCD as well, because if you do one exposure every 6 months, OCD is going to grow way faster than that. But if you do it at the proper pacing, depending on severity level, typically, then you're going to get there. It's not a perfect journey. So tips for moving forward. Here's an example. I'll pray to God for grace and strength to move on without figuring them out and fighting them and neutralizing. So the goal is to starve OCD in terms of what we call inhibitory learning. There's a fancy term for you therapists. We would say that it's called expectancy violation. I violate OCD in what it says is going to happen. And every time you do an exposure, it's a trust experiment. Does it go okay? You won't know until you actually try it, and you probably won't try it unless if it's accessible. It's not going to be accessible until you make a plan, and this is how your team can help with this. Other tips. I have 2 choices. Chase after a feeling of certainty that so far hasn't come. I can't say never technically, because maybe it could, but so far has never come, or choose to move forward to the uncertainty. As a part of ACT, that might be one of the commitments that's built in. I commit myself to live by faith, walk by faith, determined by ... And if I feel uncertain and it doesn't fit in the category of what my pastor talked about, doesn't fit in the category of what I've identified as a known area that I'm actively working on, then I'm going to make a commitment to move on. And you might have to take that step by step, but long-term in OCD recovery, when people really start to feel that freedom, they're doing that on the fly, and they're doing that with everything. They don't have to have it on their visual hierarchy written down on a piece of paper or their computer, as I do an advanced format with clients. They can then begin to just apply all of those skills. And isn't it, in essence, really about trust? If we want to talk about growing in trust or growing in faith, oftentimes, many times, I'm not going to say for you at this moment that this is the faith step, but many of my clients find that that big faith step for them was doing the therapy or taking the medication. For me, it was at one time when I've done my own treatments for my own disorders. That was a big step of faith. All right. So other tips. My goal is to focus on doing the tasks that I need to be doing in the present. Studying, cooking, talking, instead of focusing on trying to figure out the uncertainty and fear. It's back to those values again. Focus on the present moment and allow my thoughts to come and go. Trying to figure it out only makes it worse. God understands that I don't understand. That takes a little time sometimes for clients to be able to build that follow through on the commitment. I word it this way, that it is, can you trust that God will show you or reveal to you, or can, outside of your own brain if you really need to know something? It doesn't take the distress away, but it's a starting, that's a cognitive intervention, by the way. Because if a person doesn't know that, doesn't believe that, and they believe they've just got to think it through more and more and figure it and change the feeling, well, part of the cognitive piece is to look at the actual belief there. Do you really, really believe that if it's actually that important, that God might make it known? And if you can say yes to that, or any number of variations of affirmations by faith and actual beliefs, then you can start to make some commitments in decisions and to do some exposures. So if I have just felt really distressed and upset, angry, irritated, and then I come to communion and I think of the verse that says to examine yourself, and it has a warning of not examining oneself. And I think back and my mind is hooked on the fact that, man, this week I felt really angry. But then my brain is also like, well, I don't have a specific exam. I can't think of punching anybody in the face. I can't think of specifically wronging anybody. And I'm asking God for that, but I just feel like there's something there. Okay, well, building that foundation of what do you actually believe? What do you actually think about that? Well, I'm supposed to confess it if I know it. The pastor said, if you're not exactly sure, then okay, great, move on. You can throw that into a general prayer. God, it's yours. Even the things that I'm uncertain about, and you've got to make it known to me outside of my own brain. And bada bing, bada boom, move on from there. The hard part is the moving on. I don't expect you as a clinician just to bounce, hop, skip, leap. Oh, thanks, Justin, for that feedback. Now I'm cured. Not at all. We start from that foundation, and then we do the work. We sit with it. So the exposure in that moment is probably to take communion. Actually, maybe the first exposure is to even go to church that same day, or go to the pastor, priest, etc. The first step, it doesn't matter what it is. If you're facing it without compulsing, then you're starting to win against this thing. You're starting to play offense rather than defense. And offense is how we begin to move to maintaining rather than being controlled by. Okay. The goal of treatment, according to Mark Friesen, is not at zero thoughts. So back to the cure question. The goal is not to, even that you would never have a compulsion again. You will have lapses if you have OCD, most likely, but that's not the same as a relapse where you go back to where you were prior, before treatments, or when this was at its worst. So the most reasonable goal is some thoughts of varying intensity and frequency with relatively little upset. And that's not you feel upset, that's you getting upset, you responding in a way of being upset. No interference in day-to-day living. So doesn't mean you don't get distracted, doesn't mean that you weren't the most mindful at that work meeting. It means that you're still going to work and you're able to redirect that, you're able to catch it at times. This is where we want to go, and we have to set ourselves up realistically for that. Okay, let's see. A couple of questions that are coming up with EMDR. No, okay, just be your therapist. Thank you. Let's see. I'm seeing a bunch of these here. Bear with me. I think I saw another question on EMDR, but I missed that one. So let me pull this one up. My son has done some EMDR for trauma and PTSD, and for the OCD, does he need exposure therapy? Don't know. So exposure, to be clear, exposure therapy is a treatment of choice for all anxiety disorders, PTSD, and OCD. It is not a treatment of choice for addictions. It's not a treatment of choice for schizophrenia. So it has its limits. We have to be humble about that. I'm not here just peddling some snake oil as a cure-all, because it's not. Absolutely contraindicated. If you have an addiction, I do not want the addict to be the alcoholic, for example, taking little dabs of alcohol and putting it on their tongue and seeing how far they can get with that without, because it's a different disorder that works differently. So OCD, the gold standard recommendation, without a very intentional reason otherwise, or a person turning down ERP is the gold standard recommendation. So With PTSD, one of the most effective, there's 3 first-line treatments for PTSD, and one of them is actually prolonged exposure. A lot of people are kind of shocked at that, like, wait, what? But it's to really face those situations and things that a person is avoiding or hasn't been able to, like getting out. Maybe a loved one died in a terrible accident, or a veteran experienced his friend getting killed overseas, and they come back and they can't go to a large public gathering or go to a restaurant with a lot of people or noise. Well, exposure therapy is tremendously helpful to be able to, maybe one step at a time. Maybe I walk down the sidewalk past people if I was avoiding that. And then maybe I go to the grocery store, and then so on and so forth. So exposure therapy is often highly recommended for PTSD. But EMDR specifically is a first-line treatment for PTSD as well. It is not for OCD. Why? I did write an article on this. You can justinkhughes.com, search just EMDR under my blog, justinkhughes.com/jog. And it talks about it a little bit more, but simply put, if there's trauma and that's being treated specifically with EMDR, okay, that's oftentimes indicated. But where non-OCD clinicians get tripped up is they hear what sounds like trauma, like, oh my goodness, like you are really, really stuck on this thought, or the person with OCD may focus on a specific memory or a specific time when OCD was particularly bad, and they call it a trauma, and maybe it is, but if they call it a trauma versus recognizing that the main thing that's maintaining it at that moment, if that's what it is the compulsion, then EMDR sometimes can actually facilitate compulsing by proxy, because the person is just running through the same things again and again, just talking it through. And it can cause more harm and sometimes just not help a person do better. Now, there has been a little bit of recent research about EMDR being helpful with OCD, and it was just very initial, and we don't know a whole lot about it. It would appear that it's helpful in some particular ways, which one of the most obvious probably being that if you have trauma that actually is being addressed, and you're making sure not to compulse, or that the client is not compulsing, EMDR might have its place. It's just not the go-to for OCD completely by itself. So, and thank you so much. We have therapists specialize, heartbreaking to talk with people who are crippled by scrupulosity. It's a tough thing to deal with, but relief is possible. Absolutely. And thank you so much, Animal Lover. Having to jump off here, but for your thank you. Really glad that you've enjoyed it so far. By the way, just checking in here, we're going to get to some of the end questions that were sent by subscribers as well. Make sure to get some dedicated time on those specifically. Principles of effective and religiously sensitive exposure. I got to take this and adapt it for clinicians on the OCD and Faith webpage of the IOCDF at this point. So that is out now if you want to check it out. And actually, because you can look at that article at any time, I am now going to just fly through this. But it is helpful steps for the integration of religious spiritual beliefs in therapy, and using CBT, ERP, and ACT skills, so important. Coping tips, as he said, coping, I like to think of it as affirming, facing. And okay, so want to cover, what do you have to do? What do you not have to do? You do not have to do exposures that involve doing things your faith specifically forbids or says is sinful or immoral. Oh, I left that one comment up. There we go. So to be really clear, you do not have to destroy, tear, or burn your Bible, use a Ouija board, look at pornography, things like sit in church shouting things in your head you consider blasphemous. Why do I say, some of y'all know exactly why I'm saying this. Some of y'all may be new here. Well, over time, there certainly has been a reputation and plenty of stories that clients have told, that therapists have said at different points. And there's either one of two problems. One, it was a problem of assessment of a therapist, or it's a problem of assertiveness of a client. That, for example, if you go to a clinician who has no particular faith views, considers themselves completely secular, maybe agnostic themselves, but maybe they don't ever say, or you don't know necessarily, but by and large their approach is through that. And you say that you were watching TV the other day and you heard in a TV show a person say the word pornography, you're immediately triggered and you started to obsess. Did I participate in pornography because they said that in the TV show? Well, if the therapist fails to assess properly, they don't know that, oh, well, I don't want to do that. That's not part of my beliefs and values. It's against that. Then, well, if they recommend, oh, okay, well, you know what? Then look at pornography as your exposure and don't compulse. Whoa, we have a problem with assessments right there, because the clinician has completely missed the fact that that is baked into something that is central to beliefs and values for you. But sometimes it's an issue that the client doesn't speak up as well. And so, for example, if the issue is, let's say, alcohol consumption, that's a really diverse one. There's folks in most belief systems that are on every side of alcohol consumption. And let's say the person says that they had a sip of wine at a wedding or did the champagne toast at a wedding. And then they were obsessing on getting drunk afterwards. And if they were in sin, if they were in wrong or did wrongdoing or whatever else, well, let's say that the therapist hasn't assessed inappropriately. They hear that the person wanted to take that sip of champagne to toast the lovely couple at the wedding. But they hear the person compulsing, and the person never tells them that, well, I had made a decision years back that I would never really drink, and I don't want to drink. And if the therapist says, okay, well, let's get a bottle of champagne and toast each other in a therapy session, it's not a problem of assessment, it's a problem of assertiveness, because the client is not actually telling them, this is my personal conviction. This is my matter of conscience with this. So to be clear, got to speak up, got to be assertive. And these things are also going to be messy. Maybe sometimes you won't know, and a good clinician is going to help you separate out. That sounds a little bit compulsive, such as maybe being close to a bottle of alcohol at a wedding, or fill in the blank. But it all has to be functionally analyzed for you, particularly with those things. Some things are more clear in black and white. A lot of things aren't. And that's where OCD loves to thrive, is in the uncertainty. Okay, what else? You do not have to give up the core beliefs of your faith. You do not need to learn, you do need to learn how to follow the tenets of your faith and not OCD's skewed version of faith. Big one. Can you pause with that with me? How do you walk your faith but not OCD's skewed version of faith, morality, belief, spirituality? You don't have to leave or stop going to your church. You do need to learn to live in a way that is functional. One asterisk, you don't have to leave or stop going to your church. Sometimes clients go to wonderful churches. And here in the Dallas area, I know a lot of different churches and leadership and folks throughout, but sometimes there are seasons as well. And sometimes a church just is not a great fit for a person at that point. When they're so overwhelmed, they might need something different as well. But just to be clear, no clinician can just say, oh, you should leave church. I hear that you're really, really distressed there. Actually, it could be the best exposure for you to be able to go back into church. But just so you hear up front, where you don't have to do that as an exposure, unless if your exposure means that you skip a Sunday or you skip a day going in, so that you can have 1 week where you sit with distress of, oh my goodness, I missed church. What does that mean if that is your obsession? Does that kind of make sense? I hope it does. That we're going after the pathological obsession, the pathological compulsion, most specifically. You don't have to completely stop praying, but you do need to learn to pray in a way that doesn't feed into OCD. You do not have to share or agree to the same religious beliefs as your therapist, but you do need to follow through on agreed upon exposure exercises. If you have to change, some of those things. But at some point, you really have to follow through with a certain commitment level to get the most out of therapy. Okay, so get some additional resources. Their website is accounseling.org, which is at the beginning of the slides. There's also scrupulosity.org, OCDandchristianity.com. IOCDF now has the OCD and Faith webpage, and we're also trying to break specifics down for specific faith and religious groups. I recently wrote the one on Christianity, and a few books that are provided here. His full references can be reached through him for the slides here today. Okay. So this is where I want to jump into. I see a few more questions, but I'm going to give the priority, of course, to the subscribers that had reached out with these last 10-ish minutes here. So how does a person determine how much of the religious practice being observed is values-based regarding religion and how much is OCD, especially when one was not raised religiously? So Deborah, thank you so much for that one that you had sent. This is going to harken back to the consideration of involving your team, clergy, etc. Heck, I mean, when folks come in and they say, I don't have a particular persuasion, but I am trying to identify what I even believe, and from a worldview standpoint. Okay, well, as a state licensed clinician, I'm not going to say go to my church. That's not appropriate for me to do to somebody who's saying I'm not interested in your specific views, Justin. But some folks need to pull up a book on how do you identify your worldview, how do you develop your worldview? They might just start there more philosophically in general. And so how do you determine whether the practice that's being observed is values-based? Well, the simple answer is you work with where you are at that moment. And so if you are a Christian, for example, what does your church say? One of the notes that I had skipped for time that Ted talks about is the 85% rule, that if 85% of your congregation does something, that's normative for them. By the way, I'm not saying that you wouldn't go beyond normative. I work with many clients that once they do the work of ERP, and once is really key, that they can actually separate out the compulsions more, and they may actually want to grow more towards being even more disciplined. And it's very possible to be more intentional, more disciplined than the average population. But when you're at a starting point of impaired or disabled by OCD, then it's super, super key to say, I've got to start with something. And so if taking communion, if you feel like you need to take communion every time you sin, for example, or say something wrong or think something wrong, well, what is the rest of your congregation doing? If they're doing it once a month, or maybe some people grew up in a church that did it every week, and they are in a church that's doing it once a month now. And so you might feel the urge to do it every single week. Well, you can later, once you determine what is compulsive or not, determine what additional you might do. You might go to one of the board meetings and make it as a suggestion. I'd really like to do it once a week, but that is very different than recognizing it as a current compulsion. And so at some level, you have to get a team that you can ask a question or two and get a point of feedback or two. And at some point, you have to trust it. You have to go with it to start with. Not saying you wouldn't change the approach, but the number one task we're after with OCD is the compulsions and not compulsing. All right. Second question, thoughts on whether someone with severe scrupulosity can actually observe according to religious law without going overboard, or whether it's likely to create more pain. Yeah. Best I can say is it's messy. The whole point of scrupulosity is that it's impairing, it's entangling, it's creates narrow focus. As I talked about those differences between healthy faith and OCD. And so if it's just going to be messy, the definition of it is going to tell us that, no, that's kind of impossible to really, really do that without going overboard. It's baked into that. Otherwise, it wouldn't be OCD, right? I'm not meaning to minimize the question in any way with that. But at some point, too, we have to take a triage view, a priority view, that it feels like I have to get this one thing right. I have to know this. But if everything else that's going by the wayside is the functioning and mental health and the ability to do all these other things because the person is stuck on the one point of communion, well, okay, maybe with communion, they'll get to a place where they grow further. But for treatment, they're going to have to come to the place where they can be able to have some amount of diffusion to take a step back from that and work on those other priority things, and kind of involves a little bit of trust. And some people don't have that until their hand is forced and they feel completely overwhelmed. And the more severe a case is, the less insight there typically is, and the more factors of complexity. And that's when intensive treatment options many times are really needed, where medication oftentimes becomes almost essential in certain cases, and so forth. So I hope that helps. How do you keep scrupulosity from affecting your relationship with God? I used to see God as so kind, loving, and gentle, and now I feel scared, unworthy, and separated from him. He's all I want in this world and desire him more than my next breath, but it seems as if I'm in spiritual warfare and trying my best to hold on to faith. I'm so sorry. Yeah. So scrupulosity, as we've defined it, as OCD. If you have OCD and scrupulosity, then by definition, you will feel like you're in the wrong, like you've sinned, like you've offended God, like you are unworthy. And so far as we know, those feelings are not any different from how you would feel as if you did do those things. And you might even compare it to times in your life where you did feel separate, or were separate, or didn't believe in God, or trust in him. Fill in the blank. Well, so if that's the case, it could be easy to call it spiritual warfare. And maybe it is. Like, I'm not here to say that spiritual warfare doesn't go on in these things. That would be incredibly arrogant of me to do that. But the question is, what do I do with this? And if there are compulsions, then not far behind will be impairments. And if there are compulsions, not far behind will be lots of fear and getting tied up and wrapped up in it. And so from an OCD standpoint, as a person of faith, like, I would love to say, do more faith, right? In some ways, I have that instinctual response, like, oh man, I want you to feel better in your relationship with God. But if it's not really a faith issue, and this is our argument as this is our, well, I guess I'm saying a lot of us as ERP therapists on the OCD and faith task force that I'm a member of, in the many presentations that I've been a part of this year talking about this, there's a lot of us that are trying to really, really hit this home, that maybe that doesn't say anything at all about your faith. Maybe actually faith is really, really strong, and it's been God that's been upholding you this far, even with these terrible, terrible obsessions and whatnot. I don't know you personally, and so I don't know those details, but I do know OCD, and I do know many, many sufferers, hundreds, now thousands of hours spent walking with and working with and treating OCD and scrupulosity as well. And so the simple thing is deal with the OCD, to the extent that OCD is thriving. And then you'll also be able to better separate. You'll gain the clarity naturally. If you're trying to gain clarity on something that you're obsessing about, you will not get it. You're just going to feel more uncertain. So you have to do business with those compulsions first. All right. 2 more questions, and then I'm going to wrap up. So we're at 2 hours. Although I was saved as a child, lived as a Christian for years, this year I was struck by a feeling that the gospel is too good. Yep. And shouldn't get a free gift and merciful. It scares me to feel like I'm purposefully rejecting Christ, and I ruminate for hours every day. Isn't that the irony, right, of OCD? That even with something good, like too good, try to make myself accept his gift and not be prideful. Sometimes I feel like I do, but the relief is short-lived, and the feeling of rejection always comes back around. This has made life very difficult in the past few months, and I don't know how to disengage. Really rooted in the reality of my spiritual life. So just got an example of that recently that I was talking about, and I had to laugh at the irony, not in a minimizing way, but with the person I talked to, because that's just one of the ways that OCD can function. If you have OCD, it's absolutely one of the ways that it can function. That's, oh, this thing is too good, and somehow I need to punish myself to make myself good enough for it. Now, it sounds like you're already baked into this would be the fact that you know that there's, you probably have some ideas about what you actually think and believe. If you really don't, if you've never heard differently on what is true or not with this, okay, that's where the cognitive work is going to come in, where you actually look at your beliefs, you actually try to develop those a little. You're not going to spend a lot of time giving yourself a week limit to talk to a pastor, talk to one other trusted person, maybe read an article or 2 on it, bada bing, bada bing, and then define what is compulsive, and then start to attack that and go from there. I hope that helps. I just really want to thank you so much for being here. Just as a reminder, please, please, please subscribe, justinkhughs.com/getunstuck. Everything, literally everything is free there. I'm not trying to sell you anything. Lots of free guides, information, and I want to give you a free gift through it. Let's do this again. I think it's been really, really good for me to be able to give this, and I hope it's been helpful for you. One mention too, you can find me in person at the International OCD Conference in Denver here in just a couple of weeks, 2 weeks from today. The Thursday activities start. I'll be doing 2 presentations, one of which is on Sunday morning on how scrupulosity is not a faith issue. What? So we'll be talking about that in some similar and also different ways. This will be uploaded automatically to YouTube as soon as it renders the video. And I think that's pretty much it. Thank you again. It has been truly an honor. Many blessings to you. And my prayer for you today is that you can grow from a faith and spiritual standpoint, and also in the cognitive, in the behavioral, in the relational. These things can all come together in mind, body, spirit. Really grateful. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day. And I'm going to give you some fun music to go out on. Let's get it. Yep. There we go. I know. If my wife's watching right now, she's like, this is so uncool. But I like it. Hope you enjoy.